Well, I have the pleasure today of introducing Bobby Brewer Wallen. And if you've attended a play at Willamette, you've already witnessed Professor Brewer Wallen's genius in designing costumes that reflect and affirm the actor's character. He does it so expertly that you might not recognize the talent and experience it takes to achieve that goal. In his lecture today, he will describe his method of creating costumes. In Brewer Wallen's 16 years at Willamette, he's designed costumes for more than 77 plays produced on the Willamette stage, plus 30 more at other theaters in summer months. Break that down, it's an average of 7 plays a year. Added to that, he teaches 6 classes a year, all related to costume design, history, and stage makeup. Clearly, he loves his profession and practices it all 12 months of the year. Last month, he costumed a play called Revolt. She said, "Revolt again." ICLers, you will remember it. The director walked us through that very particular play not too long ago. And the characters have no names or descriptions, and the play has no plot or written dialogue. Of course, the actors still had to wear costumes, and we look forward to hearing just how Professor Brewer Wallen went about creating them. And that'll be a wonderful second half to that earlier lecture. Professor Brewer Wallen has degrees from Lewis and Clark and the California Institute of Arts. He's married to Gabrielle Brewer Wallen, who's also a theater director. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
So, I teach costume design, I teach costume history, I teach stage makeup. I also teach in part of Willamette's first year college colloquium series for first year students. And in the fall, I taught a class on protest clothing. So looking at the way through history that clothing has been used in various forms of protest, including wars and things like that. I've also taught a class for college colloquium on clothing and memory, and looking at the way that clothing embodies memory and the memory that those items of clothing hold, especially items that were worn for a significant event. And I'm sure all of you can think about maybe for a wedding or a graduation or a particular event in your own life, even a uniform, or maybe something that was made especially for you by a parent or grandparent. And then I also teach regularly, I teach our senior thesis capstone class on solo performance, where theater majors are creating a body of work for themselves that they perform, as well as writing a theater, what we call a manifesto, sort of why they do the work that they do as a theater artist. So I attended Lewis and Clark College as an undergraduate. I did not study theater. I was a double major in art, visual art, and religious studies. And when it came time to do my senior thesis as an undergraduate, I wanted to combine the 2 degrees. And so I decided to design and make a series of liturgical garments. So I did an oral history with 6 individuals who I knew that worked in various different faith traditions. Through those oral histories, I learned from each of them about what kinds of symbols are important, what is the garment that they wear in their active religious life, and from that, I designed and wove the fabric. I taught myself to sew, and then I constructed these garments. It was hugely ambitious at the time, and I look back and I think, wow, I had a lot of nerve to sort of approach this thing that I didn't really know how to do. but it was very rewarding, and the outcome was quite successful. After I graduated, somebody I knew who worked in high school theater said, "I know that you know how to sew. Would you be interested in making costumes for us?" And I said, "Well, I've never done that, but I'll try." And I tried it, and I really loved working with the students and working on the theater costumes in that way. So I did that for a number of years, and then I got hired by some small theater companies in Portland, and I started to do it professionally. I was getting paid, but I realized I didn't really know what I was doing, right? I was just kind of making it up as I went. So after doing that for a number of years, I decided, you know what, I should really go back to school, get a graduate degree in this, study this, so that I am doing it in the best possible way. So I went to CalArts in California and finished there in 1998. My first teaching job was in Bakersfield, California. While I finished a year early, my wife was completing her master's degree in directing. And so I was driving over the Grapevine 80 miles each way every day in order to teach and to make money, right, so that we could continue to support ourselves and live. After doing that for a year, I said, that's enough. I can't do that anymore. I got a job at Disney, and I worked at the Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, California, as an entertainment costumer. And so my job there was to work with all of the animatronic figures, to supervise the crew of people who went in every single night and maintained those figures that are constantly moving on the rides. And so those costumes are designed in such a way that only the pieces of them can be replaced, right? So if the thing is doing this all day long, this part of the sleeve and this part of the garment can be taken out and replaced. All of those figures run on hydraulics, which means that they have an oil mechanism that's keeping them going. And so occasionally the mechanics of that will spring a leak. And so underneath the clothes, they also wear a variety of protective gear. Sometimes even those little small world figures are wearing little diapers underneath to catch any of that liquid that might leak out in an accident. But unfortunately, even at the happiest place on earth, some of the patrons will occasionally throw ketchup or some other food at something. And so these people who work at Disneyland go in and clean these things and make the necessary repairs so that each and every experience is the same every day. So shortly after I started at Disney, I was offered a position at Willamette University. I had been searching for a full-time teaching position. That was in April. My contract at Willamette didn't start until August. So I continued to work at Disney, but unfortunately I couldn't tell them that I was going to leave. Because if I had said, I've got this job starting in August, they'd say, see you later. But again, I had to pay the bills and make sure that I was supporting my family during that time. But they were very generous and gracious in the time when I did have to leave. So what I want to talk about today is costume design as storytelling. I see myself as a storyteller. The way I tell stories is through clothing and through the way that clothing is used on stage to help an audience to better understand the world of the play. I'm not, sadly, going to talk about revolt. She said revolt again today. I would be happy to come back and talk about that at another time. But the play that I'm going to reference is A Doll's House Part 2, which I designed for Artist Repertory Theater in Portland this time last year. So, from there, A Doll's House Part 2 is written by Lucas Nath. No, it doesn't look like Nath, but that's how his name is spelled and how his name is pronounced. This is a production photo from that. But before we talk about Doll's House Part 2, we need to step back a little bit and talk about A Doll's House by HENRIK IBSEN. So Ibsen is the Norwegian playwright who wrote A Doll's House in 1879, and it was first produced in London in 1889. There was, I think, a production in Oslo shortly after the publication of the play, and there was so much outrage about the ending of A Doll's House that for German productions, Ibsen was requested to rewrite the ending, which he later regretted doing. So how many have read or seen A Doll's House? Okay, so I'll refresh your memory a little bit about the play because maybe it was a while ago. A Doll's House, the central characters are Nora and Torvald, her husband. There is a banker who works with Torvald, whose name is Krogstad, and even from that name, Krogstad, we kind of get a sense of who he is. There's character Christine Lind, who was a schoolmate of Nora's. There's Dr. Rank. Again, the name, I think, says a lot about his situation. And Rank here, in this situation, he's dying. This poor man is dying of tuberculosis. And then there's a couple of maids. There's Anne-Marie and Helen, I believe, is the other one. And then there are 3 children who we see kind of scamper through the play at various times, but we don't really get to spend much time with them. Nora and Torvald are a young couple. Torvald is a banker. He's in the early part of their marriage. They're kind of struggling to make do, and he gets very sick at one point. And so, as people did in the 19th century, when you got ill, you went to a warmer, sunnier climate. That was believed to be the way that you were going to recuperate from your illness. They didn't have a lot of money, and so Nora took a loan, which sounds like a reasonable thing to do, but it was illegal for her, as a woman in the 19th century, to sign her name to a document of that kind. She told Torvald that her father had given her the money, so she lied to her husband, and she did this illegal act. Krogstad was the person who helped negotiate this loan. And Torvald treats Nora like he would a child, as was not unfamiliar in the 19th century in the way that women were treated. Through a series of events, Nora, towards the end of the play, the 2 of them are having an argument when Torvald learns of this infraction that Nora has created. And he says, "You are unfit to raise our children. I don't know if I can even love you anymore." All these, just says horrible things to her. They receive in the mail the forgiveness of the loan by Krogstad. And when he sees this letter, he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have said those things to you." At which point she's like, no, I'm done with you. You can't speak to me this way. And clearly she says, I need to go figure myself out. And so she's at the brink of wanting to end her own life. But she takes a very brave move and she says, I am going to leave. I'm going to leave you and I'm going to leave our children and I'm going to walk out. And she does that. And that's how the play ends, is we hear the door slamming, right? So the Germans were the ones who said, we can't have a play like that on stage. What would that do, right? Women would get an idea that if their marriage wasn't going right, that they could just leave, right? So many see Ibsen's play as an early feminist writing. He didn't see it that way, but we really can see the strong roles that he wrote for women and the way that it really helped women and society as a whole to understand the possible roles for women in modern society. Lucas Hnath is the writer of A Doll's House Part 2, and he finished his MFA in 2002 from Columbia University, and had a premiere play in 2017, shortly after. So he had this very quick rise to fame. And A Doll's House Part 2 takes the story of A Doll's House 15 years later. So in his play, he imagines what Nora has been doing for the last 15 years when she left the house. She had no real skills, right? She hadn't gone to school beyond probably a middle school education, which was, again, not unusual for young girls at the time. She married when she was quite young. And so people have often wondered, what happens to Nora, right? And so Lucas Hnath sort of imagines that for us. A Doll's House Part 2, he sets up several parameters for us as a creative team, and this is kind of where we start. So I always ask my students, so when we're thinking about designing a play, what's the first thing that we have to do? And I'll ask you, what's the first thing that we have to do to even begin this process? So we have to read the play, right? We have to know the text. We have to start with the literature, right? That's the most important thing to start, because the playwright is giving us this roadmap in which to work from. So Lucas Hnath sets the play in Norway, inside the Helmer's house, just like in A Doll's House. He tells us that it's 15 years since Nora left. He tells us that the play should take place in a room, and he just broadly describes that. He says that it should be quite spare, some chairs, maybe a table, not much else, right? So that kind of gives us an idea of the setting and the space. He said it's crucial there be a door, right? We must see the door to the outside. And then he says about costumes, period, more or less. So the language in A Doll's House Part 2 is very modern. It feels different than the 19th century language that Ibsen was using. So already it has a contemporary feel to it. And by giving us the freedom to have it be period, more or less, it gives the creative team some latitude about how that might be presented on stage. So one of the places that I like to start in doing my research is looking at artwork from the period in which the play is written. So in this case, I decided I would look at the artwork of the period in which Ibsen is writing. So that's sort of our foundational material. So Ibsen is from Norway. The painter Edvard Munch is also from Norway, and Munch and Ibsen were contemporaries. So they are working and creating at the same time and in the same location. And what I like so much about, so everybody knows Munch's The Scream, right? That's kind of his most famous painting. But he also created a number of very beautiful and kind of haunting portraits of people. And when I look at the paintings and portraits by Munch, they look like they belong in the world of Ibsen's plays. And so that, for me, really kind of fuels some creativity and some imagination about where to begin the creative process and begin the research. Here are a couple of other Munch paintings. So these feel like smart, intellectual women of the 19th century. The other place that I want to begin my research is of primary research images. And so in the late 19th century, that might be from fashion illustrations. And these fashion plates were created and distributed in magazines, mostly, in periodicals. And this is how the dissemination of ideas about contemporary fashion happened. And people would buy the magazine and they would have the illustration, and then either they might make the dress themselves or they might take it to a dressmaker and say, I would like to have this made, and maybe instead of brown, I'd like it in green or something of that nature. But this is really, there are so many resources in fashion plates like this that tell us season by season what was being worn by people. In the 1890s, one of the kind of dramatic changes that we see in women's fashion is rather than a full dress, what we're seeing now are separates. So a skirt and a blouse and a jacket, which sometimes even begin to mimic more masculine fashion. So if we look at the figures here on the right, the jackets feel like they have a lapel similar to a man's suit jacket. And we see the kind of shapes that those take on. The other thing that the 19th century brings us is photography. So prior to 1840, if I am doing costume research for a play that is set in the 18th century or the 16th century, I'm reliant on paintings and drawings, right? But after 1840 and the birth of modern photography, we now have examples of real people in real clothes, okay? And that's the first time that we've ever experienced that in our history. And so what this shows us is the way that clothes actually fit on a body rather than an artist's interpretation of what that looks like. And we see in these two photos, again, separates. We see a skirt and a blouse, and in the instance of the woman with a tie, right, also a very stiff collar and a tie and a hat. And these were things that women who were in the workforce would begin to wear, right? So in addition to women being teachers and nurses and things like that, they were often working also as shopkeepers, some early doctors, right? We have women in lots of different professions in the end of the 19th century. And this might be an example of some of those things. So I am thinking that if Doll's House took place in around 1880, right, first published in 1879, so if we imagine 1880, that 15 years later is putting us at 1895, that juncture. So the way that I begin to imagine Nora is that she is working, right? She is having to provide for herself. We learn in A Doll's House Part 2, she tells us in the very beginning of the play, that the way that she has making a living is as being a writer, and she's writing women's novels. She's writing stories about the lives of women, which was quite popular at the time. So that seems like a noble profession for her. But because the language in A Doll's House Part 2 is so modern and reflects contemporary ideas and values about women, I wanted to kind of blur the lines a little bit between 1890s and today. And so I began to look at images of a very classic silhouette for women of a skirt and a blouse, right? Something that feels modern but also reflects back on the past. And of the four characters in A Doll's House Part 2, Nora is the most forward-thinking of them. She's the one that has a real trajectory and a path. And so that kind of silhouette is what I wanted to invoke for her. So this is the rendering, the painting that I did for her. So every time that I'm creating a costume, I'm creating called a costume rendering. So I'm drawing it and I'm painting it using watercolors, thinking about the fabrics that it will be constructed out of. Some costume designers at this time are using a lot of digital manipulation of things, drawing directly on a keypad of some kind, and creating things that way. But for me, part of the development of the design is working it in hand, right? There's that direct contact of pencil on paper where I have to spend time thinking about that person, thinking about that character, and how I most want to see it on stage. And so here's an image of the actor, Linda Alper, wearing the costume that was created. So as you can see in my rendering, the collar was tightly buttoned at the neck, and then through conversations with Linda and really thinking about the text, she opened the neckline of that blouse up to reveal a necklace, because one of the first things that another character remarks on Nora's dress is, "You look like you have some money," right? And so there's this sense that she has rewarded herself for all the hard work, and that was evidence in the jewelry. So the very opening of the play shows Anne-Marie, who was the housekeeper, opening the front doors to see Nora. And Nora didn't give them any advance warning that she was returning, and so it's a complete surprise to Anne-Marie that she is there at the door. So the reason that she comes back, the reason that Nora returns, is because she is beginning to publish books. She's getting some notoriety for the work that she has. And she discovers, because she goes to a banker to get some information about finances, and there is no record of the divorce. Torvald never signed the divorce papers in Nath's reimagining of these 15 years. Torvald was so heartbroken that he just never, and embarrassed that he allowed this to happen, that he never signed the divorce papers, and so the divorce was never finalized, which meant that she couldn't now take any kind of legal actions on her own, right? So she's coming back to say, I need you to sign these papers so that we can finalize this endeavor. Here we see Nora and Torvald together. So Nora enters and she's wearing a coat on top of her skirt and blouse. She comes from outside. It tells us that it is wintertime, that there's some chill in the air. And so we began to talk about, as a creative team, what is that coat, right? It's a really important sort of layer. It's a signifier that tells us that she's come from outside. It needed to be a strong, bold color. And the shape of it needed to be such that she could come in and take it off easily. So you know that sometimes you have a coat that you have to kind of move around a lot in to get yourself out of it. And I wanted her to be able to sort of shrug her shoulders and for that coat to just easily come off. So looking at a lot of different shapes of coats, both modern and historic. So we can see the black coat is kind of this shawl collar that is loose fitting in the shoulders. The white is a cape that could just be closed at the neck and could be easily taken off. The one with the sort of half cape comes from the 1940s again, but it felt like it was maybe a little bit too complicated. I looked at some period style coats, maybe that would more directly reflect the 19th century. And then, so we opened this play in February of 2019. In December of 2018, you might remember this news event where Nancy Pelosi was at the White House talking with the president, and the president was threatening about a government shutdown. After this meeting between the two of them, she is seen putting on this orange coat and walking with such confidence out of the White House, and then putting on her shades. So again, like the power of a garment to suggest a level of confidence, a level of status, and everybody thought, oh my God, what is that coat, right? That it must be something new. And she's like, no, I've had that coat for years, right? But I think that what that did is it brought it to a different level. The other thing, as we were in tech rehearsals for this play, so the early part of February, the poet Mary Oliver died. And so I saw this other image of a coat that had text on the inside of the coat. And I thought, wouldn't it be beautiful to both honor Mary Oliver and to support the actor who's playing the part of Nora by including some text on the lining of the coat that she would see, and maybe the audience would see as she took off her coat and hung it up, or put the coat back on when she's leaving at the end. And so I chose this quote, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" which is part of a poem by Mary Oliver called A Summer's Day. And so that quote felt like the question that Nora was asking, right? That this is my opportunity to do something new and different and move forward in my life. So what is it that I'm going to do? And I've included text in costumes before, sometimes on the outside, sometimes on the inside. And language, as we all know from reading plays or literature or poetry, touch us often in a really deep and profound way. And sometimes that text can be seen by the audience, sometimes it maybe is something that is simply a supportive element. So here we see Nora at the end of the play, once again, walking out the door with her signed papers. The next character we'll talk about is Torvald. And so if Nora was the forward-thinking character, Torvald seems stuck, right? His wife leaves him. He's got these 3 children. He's embarrassed by the thing that he did. He doesn't tell anybody. He eventually lies to people and tells people that Nora died, right? He starts to just make up stories. And so he felt like he was stuck in the 1880s. And so I really focused my research on photographs of men from the 1880s, as we see here, things that feel tightly buttoned up, that feel stiff, right? All the things that reflect the nature of his character. Even things like this. These are maybe a little too dapper for Torvald. And where we landed with Torvald's costume was this 3-piece suit with the older style, longer frock coat, not necessarily the more modern style of a suit that might be seen in the 1890s, which would have been more like our suit coats of today. And as you'll see in this photograph, I had chosen this kind of brown-black material that mimics then the wall of the set, to sort of feel like that he blends into the architecture. Sometimes when I'm designing, I am thinking about the stock that is available to me to save money on the overall budget. And I knew that I had that coat and that it might work for this actor. Sadly, when we got into the fitting and he tried it on, he's a little too muscular to fit in the coat, and he wouldn't have been able to move at all. So we had to kind of rethink that. And rather than building a brand new suit coat, we had this gray one in stock, and the gray also felt right in terms of the the dreariness of gray and the way that that's represented by his character. And it actually helped him to stand out just a little bit from the scenery in that way. The next character is Emmy, who is Torvald and Nora's daughter. So there were 3 children in their household. We see them in A Doll's House kind of scamper through. They're young children. A Doll's House opens on Christmas Eve, right? It shows Nora coming in from shopping and decorating the Christmas tree, and the children are there, and they're all excited about Christmas. So this is 15 years later. The boys are described as grown up now and married and have working lives. Emmy was possibly, 2 or 3 in the original Doll's House. So 15 years later, she's still a teenager, and she feels like a teenager in this writing by Hinath. And so I began to think about what are the qualities of a teenager that we often exhibit, and there's a sense of rebelliousness, right? There's a sense of going against the parent. There's a sense of potential, abandonment, right? She never felt connected to her own mother, and so what happens when we're not connected to our parent is we sort of tend to do these kind of wild things. And so I began to look at images of kind of punk images, or what we might think of like goth culture, that would have been like 100 years later from 1890s, but still allows us to think about the character in a particular way. The director loved that idea, and she also said, well, what about if it was somebody who was like really prim and proper? Like, what if they sort of embraced the other side of that? And so looking at images like this, we kind of found this happy balance for Emmy, still mostly in black, with these hints of kind of a really dark blue that were created in these net sleeves. And then we also, I gave her a dyed sort of bit of hair that kind of harkens back to that goth image. And unfortunately, you can't see it in this photograph, but she has a brooch that is a bird skull. And partly, again, that sense of the left behind. So there's this table that we see on stage, and there's the 2 stools, and there's a bird cage just to the left of the front door, which isn't shown in this photo. But the bird cage is empty, right? So again, everything has kind of been taken away. All the other furniture in the room is gone. What we see in the floor, the way the scenic designer created it, is we see, if you've lived in a house a very long time and you take a picture off the wall and you see the remnant of it, or you take a piece of furniture off the wood floor, and the wood floor is changed color slightly. So we see the shape of a piano, and we see the shape of a hutch, right? Furniture that used to be there, and he has since sold because they belong to Nora, and he doesn't want them anymore. The 4th character is Anne-Marie, and Anne-Marie is the nanny, or the housekeeper. Anne-Marie was the person who raised Nora, so she grew up with Nora in her household, and then when Nora got married to Torvald, she came along with and began to help care for Torvald and Nora's children. So there's a real deep connection between the 2 of them. They've known each other Nora's entire life. And Anne-Marie felt like the character who was solidly rooted in Norwegian tradition, right? So I'm taking these 4 characters and sort of grounding them in different places in time, but bringing them all together to help tell a singular story. So I wanted Anne-Marie to have color to reflect some ideas of Norwegian folk costume that you see here. And so these were the colors and patterns that we were looking at. And here's a photo. of her sitting there in the background. So part of the way that I am helping an audience shape the experience that they see on stage is through the clothing that the characters wear, right? I can help an audience more deeply understand the characters and more deeply understand the story that they are experiencing on stage, or I can actually get in the way and I can change or obfuscate the experience that you're having by slightly confusing the audience, by showing a character maybe in something that is not traditional, or thinking about it in a new way, or helping you to understand that this character is going on a great journey through the time of the play takes place, and that even though they start here, they're going to end up somewhere different. And I'm going to give you a few clues to where they're ending up, right? And that's going to change over the course of the play. So the role of design in theater really can help us understand better. Of course, the actors don't need costumes, right? They could just be in what we might think of as like neutral blacks, and it could be done in a very contemporary way. But the elements of design really help to embolden the experience that an audience has. So what's up next for me? Two things. The first is Blood Wedding, which will be at Willamette in April, so April 16th through May 2nd. Blood Wedding is a play by Federico Garcia Lorca. It was a play that was written in 1936, shortly before he was assassinated at the age of 38, right? Very tragically end to his life. And then I'm working on a new play called Looking for Tiger Lily, which is being produced by Artist Repertory Theater in Portland, but being shown at the Armory, the Portland Center Stage venue. So some of you may be aware that Artist Repertory Theater is on tour this year because we are without a building. We are in the process of renovating the space in Portland, and so all of the shows that are being produced are happening at different venues, and this one will be at Portland Center Stage. Looking for Tiger Lily is a brand new play. It is written by a Kaiser native born person called Anthony Hudson, who is Grand Ron, and this is his story about growing up and trying to learn about his own indigenous past. And he grew up watching the 1960 version of Peter Pan, where the character of Tiger Lily was played by this white actress named Sandra Lee, with no attempt to make her appear native. And so he grew up thinking that that's what Native people looked like. And so this play explores his own past and sort of getting back in touch with that. So that'll opens in early part of May and will run through the end of the month. So if you are an active theater goer and want to get up to Portland to see something new like that, come check that out. So I will take some questions, and I'm just going to leave this as the last slide. This does have my web address on it, so if you want to see more examples of my work, you can go, it's just bobbybrewerwallen.com, and I don't know if these slideshows are made available to you all, but you can take a reference there. So I will take some questions now. It looks like we've got a few moments.
So this is Gwen Ellen here, and I'm wondering, Nath left you a costume note. Is that typical, or do playwrights ever outline exactly what they want, or is it usually up to you?
Could you say the first part of your question again?
Well, Nath left you a note about costumes, and is that typical, or how much leeway do you usually have?
Some playwrights give a lot of information about costumes, and some do not. Sometimes a playwright might say, and she enters in a red dress, right? Which doesn't really tell us very much, except that the playwright is maybe requesting some moment of color at that moment. And so stage directions, I always urge my students to take with a grain of salt. So sometimes stage directions are written explicitly by the playwright. Sometimes they are added after the first production by a stage manager, right, helping future readers to understand what was done the first time. Yeah.
This is Eunice, and I have watched the pattern industry in years just dwindle. What do you do for patterns, and where do you get them, or do you even use them?
That's a great question. I do use patterns sometimes, but I also do a lot of draping. So draping or creating the pattern myself based on historic information. So there's two different ways of patterning. One is flat patterning, where you're literally creating an outline for the shape that you want to sew. The other is draping directly onto a form, like a dress form, and taking the fabric and creating it into a shape that would resemble the finished garment. So I teach both of those to my students, but sometimes to save time, we'll start with an existing commercial pattern and use that as a starting place, and then make some modifications to that to represent a particular period. But because of Willamette's longevity, I have a 4-drawer ×2 file cabinet full of old patterns. And so, we carefully document all of those so that we can reference those when possible. And even when using an old pattern, we have to be careful because modern bodies are not the same as bodies were, 50, 60 years ago, right? Our bodies are different shapes because people are more athletic today and they're bigger than they used to be. So, but if you'd ever like to come take a look at our patterns, come see me. Yes.
Hello, this is Bob. Thank you very much. I've learned so much from just this one talk. When you described your creative process for me very clearly. Do you engage in a collaboration as well with the director and maybe even the actors?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you describe that?
Yes, of course. So the very first meeting that happens is between the director and the scenic designer and myself, the costume designer, sometimes also the lighting designer, maybe even a sound designer. And our first meeting is spent talking about the play itself, just as you would in a discussion with like a book group, right? You analyze the text. And usually the director will present his or her vision of how they imagine the play, right? Some plays are very cut and dry about what that is, but others can be presented in lots of different formats. We've all probably seen a Shakespeare play that's been presented in multiple different ways, and that's how the director wants to envision that particular story. So we talk about the play, and then I would go away and do all of my visual research, as would my colleagues in other areas of design. Then we would come back to the table and share all of that design or research. And then once we kind of get a nod or an agreement from the director, then I would go and do the sketches and thinking about the actual characters. And then we would collaborate on colors and textures. Scenic and costumes need to work hand in hand, right, to make sure that the colors are working in a particularly harmonious way. And sometimes, yes, I like to collaborate with actors as well. And mostly that happens to help the actor feel like they have some buy-in in how their character is being presented. Sometimes I can just say, here's what your costume will look like, right? And other times it's really important for me because they're also doing a lot of research on their character and thinking about who they are and where they come from and all that. So when I can have those kind of conversations with actors, the design is richer for it. Yeah.
This is Arthur. There's a popular TV show now that might instill designer schizophrenia. It's called Outlander, and it takes place in 2 different time periods, each about 200 or 300 years apart. And I'm wondering what you think of having to design for such a show where the same characters are in 2 different time periods at the same time. What kind of a challenge would that be?
Yeah, I don't know that show, but I can imagine there are many plays even that are shifting in time back and forth. So many of you who have seen plays at Willamette over the years may remember a play that we produced in 2012 called Orlando, based on the Virginia Woolf novel, where the main character of Orlando exists over a 400-year period. So I had to think about everything from the 1600s to the 20th century, and that character had 4, 5 different costume changes, and each one represented a different era in time. And if you remember the story of Orlando, the character also transitions from male to female. So 2 of those costumes were male silhouettes and 3 were female silhouettes. So it's a beautiful challenge, and can be particularly difficult when you've got like a whole cast of people that have to do those kinds of changes. But it's an actor's, they love that, like the ability to sort of transform in that way. So I'm happy to help them.
Hi, my name's Tracy. I love costuming too, and history, but do you find it difficult to sit through a movie or TV show or a play or an opera when there have been some significant incongruities in costuming made? It just kills me.
Yes, I would say yes to that. I actually don't watch TV for that very reason. And it's more difficult for me to go to a play and thoroughly enjoy it because I'm analyzing all of the design elements. When there's a good costume drama film, that's my happy place for sure. Even like if any of you have seen the new version of Little Women, so a beautifully designed show, there are things that might sort of pull you back a little bit, but the research and the choices that she made really helped to shape those characters in an important way.
Hi, I'm Karen, and I loved the embroidery on the satin in the side on the door, on the coat that you had,
Yeah.
the red coat.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you did the embroidery.
Actually, the image that you saw was a research image, and what we did on the lining was we actually stenciled the lettering because we took the whole inside part of the lining, so it was just along the hem, and stenciling it in using special fabric markers was the quickest way to do it, because when I actually settled on the quote, we only had a few days before our opening, so it was important that I employ some people who could do it pretty quickly. But the coat was so popular, like audience goers who caught a vision of it were like, I want that coat. I mean, people were just like including my own wife. She's like, I want that coat. And I'm like, I can't just, it doesn't belong to me. I can't just give it to you. And so we ended up, Artist Rep does a fundraiser every year, a gala fundraiser. And so I said, well, let's auction this coat off. And I think it ended up going for like $1,000 or something. So I was really happy that a design choice that I had made, people recognized, and that was able to then benefit the theater.
Hi, Bobby.
Hi.
It's Deborah.
Hi, Deborah.
We're on first name basis because I have to, as we end this, I have to give you a shout out for the many years that you have assisted ICL in costuming our plays and players. We go way back.
Yes.
And, I thought my closet at home was stuffed until we came to your costume shop, which is just extraordinary. But you have been so gracious and so helpful in just a number of productions. And I really, really wanted ICL to know that and to thank you again for all your assistance.
Thank you.